Hello and welcome to today's episode of A Slice of Medieval. We're joined today by Dr. James Wright, who is an award-winning buildings archaeologist and former stonemason. An author, lecturer and broadcaster, James has appeared on the BBC and is a regular on the Great British Dig. A few years ago, I asked him to write a guest blog for my blog, History of the Interesting Bits, busting medieval building myths. The article turned into two articles with James phoning up and saying, I've just got so much material. And they're still my most popular guest blogs by a long way. In fact, I know when James is having an argument on Twitter because my blog explodes. Anyway, as a result, I take credit for, or the blame for, depending on how James feels at the time, his latest book, Historic Building Mythbusting. And James is here to talk about it today. So tell us a little about your book, James. What types of myths do you cover?
Well, thank you very much for that wonderful and amusing introduction. I do entirely blame and credit you for both, depending on how much trouble I am in at that particular point with whoever it is I'm in trouble with. So the book obviously came about as a result of this discussion that Sharon and I had about 5 years ago or so. And I look at commonly believed and repeated stories about ancient buildings, which I'm pretty sure that your listeners will have heard quite a few of. It's things like the spiral staircases all turning clockwise to advantage right-handed defenders in castles, or the fact that there are literally thousands of buildings which are far inland, which are built from ship timbers, or that there are curious scratches on the walls of parish churches which have been left there by archers practicing in the medieval period before going off to fight in the 100 Years' War, and the scratches are said to be left by them sharpening their arrows on the walls. So there's all sorts of stories that I cover in the book. Broadly speaking, I start with secret passage rumours, and there isn't a single settlement in the land that doesn't have at least one of those. I was in Norwich at the weekend, and they have literally dozens there. I think every building in Norwich is connected by a labyrinth of tunnels, according to the local folklore. And then I move on to look principally at castles to begin with. My PhD's in castle studies. And then I look at church myths. And then I finish up with 3 groups of myths based on domestic or vernacular timber frame buildings, in particular pubs, actually.
Bet you did a lot of hands-on research for the pubs bit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you're going to dive into the murky waters of pub history, one should know what one is talking about, and that will involve lots of what the anthropologists call participant observation.
Experimental archaeology.
Yeah, it could be another way of looking at it. Yeah. I mean, one of the questions I've tried to ask is where is the oldest pub? And I got into quite a protracted argument with a fella on a forum, an online forum, a few months ago. A fella was called Philip, and he wouldn't have it that his local, the Bingley Arms, was not the oldest pub in the country. He claimed that it dated to the 950s, so the 10th century. And I sort of gently tried to point out that it's actually a mid-18th century vernacular farmhouse that was converted into a pub. This guy would not have it at all. And his particular thrust of his argument was, how can you even be sure that it's of that date? You haven't even had a pint there, have you?
Challenge.
It turns out, my dear fellow Philip, I have had a pint there, and it was fairly mediocre, I might add. So I'm not sure why he was so proud of this pub. But yeah, there are these people that sort of can get really quite aerated and angry and resistant, and they try and rebut and redefine your sort of debunking or myth busting. But there is that element. But I'm glad to say that actually people like Philip at Bingley Arms are generally in a minority, because with the book I've done several things. I've tried to be quite light touch in my attitude towards the stories, in that it isn't some sort of high-handed or sneering academic take, and it's just a straightforward debunking. What I'm really interested in is the stories beneath the stories, to explain how these tales come about, why these pubs are considered to be so old, or where the spiral staircase comes from.
And you do, in one bit, blame the same people I do, the Victorians.
Yeah, the Victorians are generally the people holding the smoking gun. Lots of these stories come out of that period of time. I mentioned the ship timber story earlier. There does seem to be quite an explosion in those stories during the Victorian period, which is probably no great surprise, because a lot of the ship timber stories do concentrate on English or British battleships, usually in connection to a particular naval victory. And of those, it's almost always either the Spanish Armada or the Battle of Trafalgar, which are cited as being the originators of these timbers. And it's an issue where the Victorian world and the early 20th century world was so fiercely proud and advocating the military and naval victories of the past, because they were so sort of impressed with the British Empire. This idea of conquest and empire was hugely important in that moment, but they were also very, very proud of the victories of the past as well, which ultimately do lead to the empire. Without the strength of the English and then the British Navy, it wouldn't have been possible really to forge this great empire, which ended up with about a quarter of the globe under its control. So you can kind of see why some of those stories might be so popular. And it's a way of actually localizing something as massive as those battles or the conquest of the empire. It's a way of taking it down to like the hyper local. Well, that building there includes timbers from the Battle of Trafalgar, from a captured French ship or a ship that was one of Nelson's. It's just a way of bringing it down to something that people can readily understand, because otherwise the Battle of Trafalgar or the Spanish Armada, it's something that you learn about at school. It's almost too big to conceive of. So I think that's where quite a lot of the stories do come out of that world and that pride in empire of the 19th and earlier 20th centuries.
It's not that surprising that some people do kind of object if you're shattering their illusion of what they believed for many years without challenge.
There's an emotional attachment that people have to the stories, and that's probably the strength of the tales, the fact that they are so intimately connected with them. And I think sometimes that connects with where they've learned those stories. And quite often they have learnt it from a very close relative, usually, but not always, an older male, so a grandfather or a father, something like that. And they've probably learnt the stories in childhood. There is a certain mindset that what you learn in childhood is empirically true. You might have learnt it from a particularly loved history teacher, or a local character in the pub, or a local historian or something like that, a beloved figure. And because there's that sort of attachment to it, these figures of authority do tend to help them to thrive the stories. So I think there's an element of that as well. And if somebody is emotionally attached to a tale and the sort of tugging on the heartstrings, it's very, very difficult to explain that actually might not be based on a legitimate lived reality from the past at all. And that can lead to those Philip moments where they just won't have it. Something is something is not quite correct. So I'll be honest with you, though, the vast majority of people that I encounter are pretty good with this. That said, there was somebody at the weekend at a conference in Norwich who was absolutely incensed when I pointed out that Bodiam Castle in Sussex might not have been a very good military fortification. There's all sorts of reasons why Bodiam as a military castle does not sort of stand up. And this is one of the issues that I look at in the book. I look at the question of what is a castle, trying to define it and trying to explain why the popular view of castles is that they are military defensive fortifications, when actually they're the most complex buildings ever constructed in the medieval period. And there's so much more going on. Yes, there is a security issue with castles, but there's tons of other stuff going on within their walls, from religious matters to economic matters to administrative matters to agriculture to courts to feasting to status displays, all of these great pageants and activities which are geared towards lavish and prestigious display. For 150 years, all we've been able to concentrate on is, these are fortifications. Anyway, I sort of point out using the case study of Bodiam, which is the famous cause de célèbre, that castles actually do a bit more. And Bodiam, when you actually look at it and break it down, Bodiam in East Sussex has very thin walls, very low crenellations.
It's pretty indefensible,
It is.
basically.
It's overlooked by a hill. Its gun loops are badly sited. Its moat is very shallow. You can drain it externally very easily. And I pointed out all of these things in my paper at a conference. And a bloke came up to me afterwards during the lunch break, and he got his jaw set and his teeth clenched, and he'd gone white with anger, and he was physically shaking as he was basically accusing me of having got all of this interpretation wrong. And saying that I wasn't retentive to new ideas, and then literally stormed off and slammed the door because he was so angry with me. But he kind of come at me with this tremendous anger. So sometimes these people can pop up, and they often behave in quite baffling ways. But what I do try and do in the book is to show my working out. Yes. So this isn't something that I've just dreamed up. I've not just plucked it out of the air. I kind of set up the story, and I describe it in quite an even-handed way and explain why people might be predisposed to believe a particular story about a building, whether it's the ship timber thing or whether it's about castles and defences, or whatever the story is, and to try and set it up and give it an honest interrogation, and to try and then just sort of chip away and to question, but not to, essentially come at it with a biased view of it. And then at the end of each chapter, I simply try and explain the story, why it's proved so popular. And that's always my favourite bit, to try and explain the tale within the tale. I think, this book is a love letter to folklore. It's not this, as I said earlier, it's not this kind of high-handed debunking from a very academic point of view. I really like working within the world of folklore, as well as the world of archaeology or history or art history or architectural history, whatever it is. Folklore is still a big part of this, and the stories do mean something to the individuals, communities and cultures, societies that tell them. Yeah. And we kind of owe it to ourselves to understand the stories. And I just think that ultimately, for me, the success of the book is to try and explain those stories, not to just take them at face value, as unfortunately a lot of people do. But we can at least round them off. The stories will never go away. They never should go away. They are a part of our culture. But it's a way of giving a kind of a greater level of detail and understanding to the tales. That's what I'm trying to do ultimately.
You've obviously visited a huge number of sites in the course of, well, probably not just your research, but generally. What was your favourite site to work on? Did you have a favourite site?
Yeah, I mean, I've been asked this quite a bit, and generally I come out with the answer of Knowle near Sevenoaks in Kent, which is a mid-15th century great house that's been remodelled an incredibly large amount. It's built during the mid-15th century for initially James Fiennes, who was the Lord Treasurer of England, managed to get his head cut off during the Jack Cade Rebellion, 1450. Yeah. Then the site was purchased by Thomas Bourchier, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who developed it as his own personal property, but it does then pass through down the other archbishops. There's a big load of remodelling that occurs in the early 16th century, a load more in the early 17th century, and then there's various interventions which are made throughout the 18th and 19th centuries. So it's had a very complicated structural history, and it's kind of changed its aspect. It's got enormously bigger. Broadly speaking, as the Wars of the Roses progress, Knowle gets bigger. Anytime the Yorkists are winning, Thomas Bourchier is adding a courtyard, essentially. So it ends up with about 7 courtyards, although the complexity is quite varied. But yeah, it's just one of those buildings which I had the opportunity to do a lot of work on as a result of a major flagship conservation project by the National Trust. And they just kept asking me back to look at more and more bits of the house, and sort of started off looking at the roof structures externally, and then was gradually allowed inside and was looking underneath the floorboards, and then doing rather discrete surveys of different areas of the house, and eventually probably coming to a high level of understanding, but still having enormous questions about the property. It's so vast that there's still rooms in there that I've never been into, and there's areas of it that I still don't fully understand. And I think that's why I like working there, because every time I go back, there's new questions, there's some new answers, but there's a whole different series of other issues that pop up. So it's just become a sort of a long-lived project, which I've worked on. I've not done anything there for a couple of years now, but I've had the opportunity to just really get under the skin of the building, and it's got under my skin as well. So I like the challenge of it, essentially.
Yeah.
So, have you had any wow discoveries? Has there been a moment where you've just gone, wow?
I mean, yes, in all sorts of different ways. So you could go the big wow discovery at sort of what you might call at a very high level, and that would connect with the work that I did at Knoll back in 2014. I was under the floorboards in the King's Tower and discovered some marks and scorched burns on one of the beams under the floors, which over a period of a few weeks and months I was able to understand had been left there deliberately by carpenters who were trying to protect the space against the threat of evil spirits, witches, demons, in a particular historic moment as well, because we were able to understand from the markings that they had been created during construction by these carpenters, and we worked out that the building was being remodeled during the winter of 1605 into 1606, that it was being remodeled as royal accommodation for James I and his family, which was being presented to them as their sort of a holiday home, almost like their suite of apartments when they would come to visit the Lord Treasurer of England, Thomas Sackville. And this, of course, was being developed just after the Gunpowder Plot, when James was obviously seen to be quite vulnerable from Catholic plots. And the Catholics at the time were seen to be in league with Satan and the forces of hell. So the carpenters were quite conscious to protect the building from the supernatural threats to the king as well, and you can kind of get this sense of what was going on in the moment after the Gunpowder Plot from all sorts of things, whether it be Shakespeare's Macbeth and a whole bunch of other powder plays, as they're called, which were essentially being written in the aftermath in a very pro-royal, anti-Catholic manner, from sermons that are being preached from the pulpits, from pamphlets which were being distributed, and also artworks of the period which show scenes such as Guy Fawkes having the plot whispered into his ear by a demon, and behind the demon is a group of people in a tent who are all sat around the table, and the people round the table include the Pope, Robert Catesby, the ringleader of the plot, and Satan himself. And that gives you a very clear view of how the propaganda machine of government was working. I simply reckon that the carpenters at Knoll kind of soaked up all of that propaganda that winter, and it came out in a physical manifestation of these marks underneath the floorboards. And that was such a big wow moment that I wrote a paper based on it, and that kind of got picked up by lots of people who were booking talks. So I went around the country and still do occasionally get asked to speak about this 10 years on. It's been represented in TV programs, news articles. It went kind of viral at the time as well. So that was a big wow moment, and it opened a lot of doors for me. Ultimately, it led to my nomination to the Society of Antiquaries of London as well, which is, quite a big moment in my career too. So there was a big wow moment there. But to be honest with you, there are all sorts of wow moments that I get as excited and energized by almost every time I go and survey a building, to be honest with you. So there was a nice moment only last week. I've been on tour promoting the book, and I've been up and down the country, and I had a day off in Essex last week, and a landowner said, well, do you want to come over and look at my house on your day off? So I said, yes, please. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'll have a look at that. Great. So I went and surveyed their property, and the wow moment there for me was sort of understanding that quite a lot of this house, which was probably early modern in date, probably dated to around 1600, something like that, but quite a lot of it had been essentially made from an earlier medieval building which had been reused. And I discovered a tie beam, which is one of those great big long timbers which stretches from wall to wall in a timber building. And I realised that it was from a crown post roof, which is a particular style of roof which starts in the 1280s and runs through in Essex anyway until the late 16th century. But this was being used as a sill beam. So you got the ground wall of brick, and then this is the timber that then supports all of the studs above it. And I just like the idea of this timber, which had started off in a roof, literally coming down in the world to support this wall. And that for me was a wow moment, because I just really enjoy unpicking ancient buildings in that way. And it doesn't have to be
Mm.
something which connects to the gunpowder plot to get my attention, really.
Mm.
And are there any things that you were sort of hoping to find but didn't? Any rumors of secret tunnels or anything that you thought, well, this may be one, but it turned out to be nothing, or does that happen all the time?
I mean, with secret tunnels, the stories are so ubiquitous that, I mentioned earlier, every settlement has these stories, and there genuinely are underground spaces. And I've been fortunate to look at quite a lot of them over the years. In terms of subterranea, I've had a lot of fun looking at a tunnel at Strelley Hall, just outside Nottingham. Now, this is a site which is well known locally because it has quite a good cafe and a whole suite of shops there and that kind of thing. And there's businesses who operate out of the building, and the landowner is quite a character. Richard Henshaw's quite well known locally too. So a lot of people have a fondness for Strelley Hall, and it's this 18th century small mansion house. It dates to roughly 1790, but underneath it, and I've discovered this in two periods of excavation work, is a mid 14th century courtyard castle, which is really difficult to see now. We've excavated a bit of the moat around it. There's one tower which is buried within the later hall. And then there's this whole suite of cellars which are there for beer and wine and general storage. But then genuinely off these cellars is this underground tunnel. It's brick lined. It tends to fill it with quite a lot of water on a rainy day, and it then kind of turns round the corner, and then you're confronted with a whole series of rock cut chambers. And these rock cut chambers are almost certainly the base of another medieval corner tower from the 14th century. And there's even a bit of one of the doorways surviving there as well. And the tunnel has essentially been cut and created to link this medieval tower basement with the cellars of the 18th century house. So the tunnel exists, it's real, there's genuine subterranean there, but it's been created as a service passage so that people who are going down into the cellars can then access the basement of the medieval tower, which had probably been repurposed as a cold store or an ice house or something like that. So there are these genuine underground tunnels, but that's what I quite like doing. I like finding these subterranean spaces, but then explaining them, because to an antiquarian or to one of these sort of figures of authority who sort of start the rumors to the stories that I look at in the Historic Building Myth Busting book, that could have been interpreted as a secret escape tunnel from the castle or even from the 18th century hall. But actually it has a purpose, and we kind of owe it to ourselves, to the people who patronize the construction of it, and especially to the builders of it as well. This idea of working class history, it's not there as a result of something which was an escape tunnel or because the lord of the manor wanted to sneak his mistress in or something like that. It's there for the workers of the house to access a particular space. And those working class histories often get overlooked in favour of elite histories. And I think it's important that we tell the stories correctly about our ancient buildings, because buildings do matter. They are really important in society for all sorts of ways. And I think we kind of owe it to ourselves as communities and individuals and societies to properly tell the stories correctly.
That goes directly onto my next question, because of course one of my favourite myths, having worked at Konigsborough Castle, relates to castles and the spiral staircase benefiting the defenders. Of course, at Konigsborough, the spiral staircases go both ways, and there's only one that actually does go clockwise. The others, main ones, go anti-clockwise. So is this totally made up?
It is completely and utterly made up, but it's so fiercely believed and advocated. The genesis of this story really comes out of that Victorian world, the idea that castles are defensive military fortifications, which again is coming out of the world of scientifically planned forts from the 17th century onwards, and those notions of empire and conquest. And so for the first 100 years of castle studies, they were seen that way, because basically castle studies was dominated by men, and it was dominated by men with military bearings. Many of whom had actually been soldiers themselves in the wars of empire, or in the First or the Second World War. There were so many of those, or in fact the Cold War. There were so many people who were influenced by that way of thinking. But the spiral staircase story comes out of that, and it was invented bizarrely in 1902 by an art critic called Theodore Cook. And his own biography helps to explain that. Yes, he was a Victorian, so he was predisposed towards that view of castles, but he himself wrote a book about spirals. So he had to consider this issue of the spiral staircase. He was really concerned with left-handedness. So he's already thinking about which way round things go and how people approach things in regard to their dexterity. This obsession with left-handedness is peppered throughout his writings, not just his spiral staircase question. And he kind of thought that people excelled at whatever they did in life if they were left-handed, which is amazing, really, to think of. And he particularly drew attention to a couple of really obscure fencers that he'd seen at an expo in London in the early 20th century. Called Alphonse Kirchhofer and Louis Marignac. And he really did bang on about these two guys at great length in his book. And you start thinking, well, where's this coming from? You know, because he was otherwise pointing at people like Hans Holbein and Leonardo da Vinci, famous people that he thought were left-handed. So why is he going on about these really obscure Franco-German fencers? And then you realise, actually, that his other great love in life was swordplay. That he was a fencer himself, and he founded Oxford University's fencing club. He was a journalist who wrote about fencing, and he sat on various committees connected with fencing, including one that picked British Olympic fencers. So you put all of those things together in the context of the Victorian world, in the context of the man himself, and there's almost no way that he wouldn't come up with the spiral staircase story that they all turn clockwise to advantage right-handed defenders. And it might have stayed there. It might not have got as popular as it did, but for the fact that in 1938 we have The Adventures of Robin Hood, the Hollywood film with Errol Flynn and Basil Rathbone, who have this amazing set-piece sword fight on a spiral staircase at the end of the film, which is where Guy of Gisborne meets his sticky end at the blade of Robin Hood. And that kind of gives it license for the public to believe the story. And then there's a castles historian called Sidney Toy. And Toy was one of the best-selling people ever to have written about castles, and he shifted some serious units as a result of that, and Flynn and Cook dreaming it all up. People just come to believe it in the second half of the 20th century to the extent where it's almost the only thing that most people know to be true about castles, and yet it was invented in 1902 by an art critic. I'll be honest with you, you asked me, you know, what some of the favorite things that I've found and what I wish I could found have been in this podcast. And to be honest with you, that is one of the things that I'm most pleased and proud of, to be honest with you, to be able to finally chip away at that story, which most castle specialists knew to be untrue, but didn't quite know what its genesis was. And to be able to point to Toy and then to Flynn and then initially to Cook, I think to sort of show that development of the story, but also its earliest citation, and to explain the world it comes out of. That's something I'm particularly pleased with, given my career in castle studies as well. I feel it's a genuine original contribution to be able to make to the discipline, really. Although most of my colleagues sort of grin at me rather wryly and wonder why I would even bother doing that, to be honest with you. But if it is the one thing that most people know about castles, it's worth approaching.
Yeah, because it's everywhere, isn't it?
Well, you said something one day about them, and you said, so, because to be honest, if they're in the keep, where on earth are they going to go? By that point, everybody's lost. And so ever since with this spiral staircase, I've got this image of the defenders going further and further up the keep, still trying to defend it, getting to the roof, and then jumping off like lemmings because there's nowhere else to go.
Yeah, and there is no medieval account of a sword fight on a spiral staircase. And as you say, if you genuinely are fighting on the stairs, come on, the game's up. You know, you've really, really lost at that point. And as you said earlier, with regard to Konigsberg, 30% of castle spiral staircases do go anti-clockwise. And although some people have said, but they're more prevalent in the late medieval period, they are still there in those early Norman castles.
Yeah.
But even slightly before, you can spot these staircases at places like the Tower of London itself, which is built in the 1070s. A little bit later is the Great Tower at Norwich, which is built around 1100, and that had originally 3 anti-clockwise spiral stairs. There wasn't actually a clockwise stair in it. And you're in that sort of situation where the story massively falls down, because if castles are military and they are built during conquest, then every aspect of them should be geared towards defense. But of course, even in those early conquest castles, the staircases aren't. But again, this links into that issue that we started the podcast with, that I'm not convinced that castles are primarily forts anyway. And quite a lot of their architecture is not driven towards defensibility, and it is geared towards pageantry and ceremony and ritual and hierarchy and prestige and showing off.
Display of power, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
I think the earlier ones, I mean, the Norman ones are essentially garrisons, aren't they? I mean,
Even then, I would be saying, well, there is an element of security there, but we know that garrisons are not particularly sizable
yeah,
in castles at all. So even those Norman ones, the Motte and Baileys, etc., yes, there is going to be a security issue with them, but there's still, even at that early period in time, so much more going on within and without their walls that we can't just say this is a military barracks. And actually garrisons tend to be quite small because they cost a lot of money to maintain.
yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say, I discovered during my research on the Warrens, when the Earl wasn't there, the castle had about 3 men-at-arms.
Yeah.
It was only when the Earl was there that there was a number of people there.
Yeah, and those retinues of medieval elites can be quite sizable, but even those retinues don't tend to incorporate large numbers of soldiery. They tend to be the people that are required to service the elite household. So it's all sorts of interesting people, such as chaplains and bakers and blacksmiths and farriers and grooms and people to look after elements in the kitchen, such as the sorcerer who's making the sauces, or the laundress. That's who's making up these elite households, not 500 or 5,000 soldiers. And just to go in terms of garrisons again, the famous castles of Edward I in Wales, they only really were ever intended to have between about 25 and 40 soldiers in them at any one given time. So again, they're not really going to work that well as forts, because they could be very easily bypassed, because a garrison of 25 people is not really going to bother a Welsh revolting army at all. So yeah, there's all sorts of issues revolving around castle studies. I think a lot of this idea that castles are primarily military forts comes out of the Victorian world, but is then instilled in the way that castles are taught about in schools. Still to this day, most schools, most teachers who teach castles are very much stuck in the thinking of the 1950s and 60s. It's the way it's presented in Hollywood, with lots of battles and sieges, Kingdom of Heaven, Ironclad, those films. And I think also in the popular presentation on mainstream television with documentaries such as The Secrets of British Castles, which just concentrate all the time on siege warfare. And yet sieges were so unbelievably rare, and yet chroniclers foreground them because it's a big story, in the same way that war and conflict is enormously important to the mainstream media to this day, because it sells papers, it gets clicks on websites. Chroniclers realized that in the past as well, so they would tell these really adventurous stories, and that kind of comes down to us through visits to sites as well. You go to places like Warwick Castle and you go into the gift shop, and it's just a sea of plastic swords and shields and helmets for the kids, and it's there in kids' books as well. So you can kind of see why people believe that castles are forts, but they really weren't. They were so much more complicated, and there was so much going on. One of the things that I really like looking at is castle gardens, which every castle had its garden, going back to the earliest periods, sometimes within the walls, sometimes in a separate enclosure, sometimes entirely separate beyond the walls. I'm thinking about places like Richmond or Montgomery, which had gardens. And these were places where men and women could be alone together. And they're quite, if you look at the poetry associated with castle gardens of the period, things like Tristan and Iseult or Chaucerian poetry, you're finding out that actually these are quite naughty, racy, quite sexy spaces, and there's a lot of sort of amorous poetry which is written about the activities that go on within Castle Gardens. So again, you're looking at a completely different viewpoint there.
Yeah.
It's not all warfare. There's the sexy stuff going on in castles too.
Even the idea of a motte and bailey, the bit on the motte is actually quite small. The bailey, they're an inner bailey and outer bailey. They need space for the servicing of the castle and the estates around it and so on, and people coming in and out. So the clue is there, really.
The clue's in the landscape.
Yeah.
Because castles themselves can be reasonably small, they can be reasonably large, depending on the need, the status of the patron. But also, the castle doesn't stop with the walls. Castles have impacts on landscapes around them. These landscapes of lordship are enormously important because the castles are the centre of an estate.
Yeah.
And an estate is seen to be analogous to the country. So a well-run estate is analogous to the good maintenance of a nation. And so you see this stage management of estates around castles. Now, my own PhD is on Tattershall, which is a 13th century castle, which is massively remodeled in the 15th century. And you see what's around it. You look beyond the 3 wards of the castle, and you've got an outer enclosure which incorporates a water gate down to the river, but also mills, fish ponds, rabbit warrens, dovecotes. Beyond that is the village, and everything there is laid out by the lord of the castle too, into regular burgage plots around a massive, truly massive marketplace, which includes its buttercross, which has all of the iconography of the lord around it. He also was responsible for the foundation of a collegiate church within that extramural enclosure. Next to that are almshouses. There's a chorister school. Beyond the village environment, you've got the open fields. Beyond that, you've got a deer park. Beyond the deer park is the old family mortuary of St Leonard's Chapel. Adjacent to that is Kirkstead Abbey, which is, again, the old family religious enclosure because your piety was part of your lordship display. And beyond that, again, is Tattershall Chase, a massive hunting reserve, which includes on the outskirts a lot of villages, but dotted amongst the woodlands, you've also got these hunting towers and hunting manors at places like Whitehall and Woodhall Spa. So this is a whole landscape which is managed beyond the eye view of the castle. And the castle is powerful for a tremendously large amount of space. But it's powerful in the way of managing an estate and managing those resources. And again, security is not the primary purpose of this enormous landscape of lordship. And to be honest with you, we just know quite a bit about that one because quite a lot of it survives. But the more detailed studies are done on castles, and I sat through a great paper the other day looking at Buckingham castles, the old one and the new one in Norfolk, and at Castle Rising as well. The story that I've just told with relationship to Tattershall is there in Norfolk too, and it can be found elsewhere. There's so much more going on with castles than just looking at crenellations or machicolations or the strong gatehouse.
Yeah. Well, moving on to obviously the most important thing you've been looking at, which is the oldest pub in the country. You talked about it earlier and how it sort of it raises reactions, shall we say, without going any further with that. Why is it so difficult? Is it just the passage of time? Why is it so difficult to pin down which is the oldest pub, or are there just so many?
Well, after you've spent a long period of time looking and shouting about castles, you need to cool down, really. And I grew up in a pub, so pubs are close to my heart. I'll happily admit that I've worked in several of them, including one that claims to be the oldest in the country, and I still love a good jar down the pub of an evening. So this issue crops up quite frequently. Where is the oldest pub? There's about 24 across the country that claim to be the oldest in the land, and there's about a dozen of which I refer to as the usual suspects, whose names just keep cropping up on clickbait websites and in tourist guides all the time. And it's places like the Ferryboat, at Holywell in Cambridgeshire. The Trip to Jerusalem, which is the one that I used to work in, which claims to date to 1189 in Nottingham. The Fighting Cocks at St Albans, which claims to date to 793. Already mentioned the Bingley Arms, 953 in West Yorkshire. And there's various other ones as well. The Adam and Eve in Norwich, the Old Man and Scythe in Bolton. And they all claim quite early dates. I think that they're all claiming to be mid 13th century or older. The ferryboat at Holywell claims to date to 560 AD, which I think is hilarious. 560 AD. This is a period of time where we're not even sure that King Arthur was real. So how can we be sure that one pretty obscure pub owned by Green King now was serving beer at that point in time? In reality, it's probably a 16th or 17th century building, which might just have one wing that is late medieval. So it's about 1,000 years later than claimed. And you know, we can spot these things. We know how old buildings are. We can use buildings archaeology to get at the history of them. So these stories sort of grow up. But I suppose you've asked the question, how can we actually find the oldest pub? Well, we use buildings archaeology to do that. So we can use archival resources, we can use observations of the structure of the building, and we can use dendrochronology, tree ring dating as well. And we can throw all this at these buildings, and we get some rather different versions of the history of some of these buildings. So the Trip to Jerusalem, for example, which is probably the most famous of the claimants, they think they date to 1189, and it was a place where the Crusaders stopped off for a pint before going to the Holy Land. But in reality, that's a late 17th century building, including its caves. And it wasn't a pub until 1751, and it wasn't called the Trip to Jerusalem until 1799. And again, we can throw all of that buildings archaeology at the building and come up with quite a different story to the one that is popularly presented. And you can do that with all of the claimants. Very few of them actually have the evidence to match the claims. Well, in fact, none of them do. So to actually answer the question, and I'm not going to tell you where the oldest pub is, your listeners are just going to have to get the book.
Get the book, yeah.
Because I do point at it, but there are certain ways into this. So firstly, it has to still be a pub. You know, it has to be built as a pub. It has to have continuous service, and it's got to still be doing the job. So that does discount quite a lot of buildings which might be quite ancient, but they weren't developed as a pub to begin with. You know, a lot of these are converted into pubs in the 18th and 19th centuries, some of them even in the 20th century. So it's got to be purpose built, and all of a sudden you're down to a very narrow group of buildings which you can consider. Because what we would think of as a public house is very much, again, skewed through what was developed really in the later 18th and especially the 19th century. What we think of as a pub is very much a product of the Victorian world again. To look at the medieval period and look at what they had, which kind of the DNA of our modern pub can be traced back through to this period. They had ale houses, but we don't have any of those surviving. We can't spot them archaeologically because they're no different to a normal domestic house. They had taverns, which are quite posh. They're urban, and they cater to serve wine to elite audiences. And we have a small number of those, but none of them are still serving. So we can discount ale houses and taverns. But they also had inns as well. And these are multifunctional complexes. They include groups of shops on the street frontage. They have courtyards for gatherings and actually plays in the 16th century. They offer accommodation. They also have a brew house, a tap house, a hall, parlours, stabling at the back, storage spaces. They're quite complex structures, and we can spot them archaeologically. They stand out a mile. But there's only about a dozen of those surviving which are still operational. There's many more, bits of many more, which survive, but they're not in use anymore. Many are private houses, or they've become restaurants, or they're doing all sorts of different things. But in terms of inns from the medieval period, from before 1500, which are still serving, we have about a dozen, and none of them claim to be the oldest in the country, actually. And they include buildings such as Henry Tudor House in Shrewsbury, which we know was built for the patron. He was the MP at the time, and he was called Hugh Wigan. And that the earliest part of that has been tree ring dated to 1426. There's places like the New Inn at Gloucester, which is probably the best surviving of the medieval inns, dendrodated to 1432. So there's quite, a small number of these buildings which we can look at. But if your listeners want to find out which truly is the oldest, and I do point it out based on the current evidence, then it's then they're going to have to pick up the book, I'm afraid.
Absolutely. Why not?
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it, as in pick up the book. Historic Building Myth Busting by James Wright. I can highly recommend it. Excellent book, very well written and very entertaining.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for joining us today, James. I know you've got to get off to Leicester now. And
Yes, I've got to do the penultimate date of my summer book tour. It's the 31st date of the tour, and then I've got another 60 or so dates to do in the autumn.
You had 85 booked in last time I spoke to you, so
Keep getting bookings. So yeah, it keeps building. So if anybody does want to book me for a tour date, please do give me a shout.
thanks very much for joining us, James. It's been absolutely fabulous talking with you.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Our pleasure. We'll talk to you soon. Do join us next time when it will be Derek and myself discussing Richard, Duke of York, and whether he was a loyal lord or a traitorous knave. I've been Sharon Bennett-Connolly.
And I'm Derek Burks. If you enjoyed the podcast, please feel free to give it a like or even leave a review. And of course, you can subscribe to avoid missing the next one. So thanks for listening.